It's 6 o'clock in London, it's 1 p.m. in New York, 1 a.m. in Hong Kong, 3 a.m. in Sydney, 10 a.m. in San Francisco, and 10:30 at night in Mumbai. Greetings, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on where you are in the world. My name is Patrick L. Young. The IPO-VID livestream, Series 12, Episode 2, that in the aggregate puts us up to Episode 68, starts here. This week in Exchange Invest, the daily newsletter of the Borse Business, which I publish, we have produced a little bit of analysis of the magnificent 7 of salaries of exchange parish leaders. Makes for very, very interesting reading indeed. The magnificent 7 is led by Terry Duffy of the Chicago Mercantile Exchange Group, who, as many people will recall, suffered a rather controversial vote just the other week from his shareholders who weren't happy about his 22 million and change salary. Nevertheless, the interesting point which you can draw from our analysis, you can catch it on LinkedIn and Medium as well, is the fact that indeed, compared to market capitalization, he's taking home about 0.3% of the overall market cap, which actually puts him on, 0.03%, which puts him basically on a par with various other exchange leaders such as Jeffrey Sprecher and Nicholas Agusin of the Hong Kong exchanges. Very interesting lineup. Good to see that Adina Friedman is earning significant fruits for her revolution within the NASDAQ organization. As I say, check out online. You can read all of the analysis there about the magnificent 7 of exchange CEO salaries during the course of the last year, and see also who's the man that's earning the absolute most in relation to his market capitalization. I'll give you a little hint before you go and read there. It's not any of the people we've named already. Today, in this IPO-VID, we are meeting an SEE market builder. That's not C as in the view you can get, but SEE as in Southeastern Europe. We're focusing actually today right into what one might call the Yugosphere, the former nations, the nations that were formerly part of Yugoslavia after their independence. Ivan Steriev has been the CEO of the Macedonian Stock Exchange in Skopje since 2005, having been a member of the team which set up the exchange in 1996. He's been working at the MSE since its foundation, first as a floor manager and then as a director of the trading department until 2005. Ivan has been a member of the board of the Macedonian Central Securities Depository and commissioner at the Macedonian Security and Exchange Commission. He's a member of the supervisory board of SEE Link, which we'll get to talking about later, an EBRD supported project started by Bulgaria, Macedonia and Zagreb stock exchanges to create a regional infrastructure for linking securities trading across these 3 markets. Ivan, welcome to you today. Let me ask, where in the world are you today?
Hello, Patrick. Thank you for inviting me to this prominent show. I'm here in Skopje, the capital of now North Macedonia. It's a former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia, or before that Republic of Macedonia. So it's a complex story about the name of the country.
So that's very interesting. Do explain a little bit, because obviously we know a little bit. I mean, it used to be Macedonia, then it was for a period of time, if I remember correctly, it was FYROM, the former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia. At least that was how it was translated into English. Now it's called North Macedonia. We know that that's all to do with relationships between the Greeks to on your border, and of course the exciting, wonderful world of who actually claims the right to Macedonia, which, as I know from my poor study of ancient Greek, is #it's complicated in the modern world. But you're still the Macedonian Stock Exchange.
Yes, and the name of our company remains the same. We are Macedonian Stock Exchange. It's a joint, it's a corporation, joint stock company here, headquartered in Skopje. We are a completely private entity. Our shareholders are primarily banks and brokerage houses, although some individuals are also shareholders. So what is the point? According to that agreement that we signed with Greece, state-owned institutions or state, let's say, agencies, they have to change their name according to this new treaty with Greece. But in our case, the adjective could remain because we are privately owned. So it's on non-exclusive basis. So it can be, let's say, Macedonian Stock Exchange in Greece as well, but we can be with this title as well. So we are still and will remain Macedonian Stock Exchange.
Oh, thank you for that. It helps clarify for those of us who got a little bit left behind in the arguments that have been taking place, obviously, with the Greeks and your own government over the course of time. So the Macedonian Stock Exchange, tell me a little bit about its foundation and how it built itself up.
We were set up back in the 90s. That was part of the all reforms that were, let's say, underway at that time, the transition from centrally planned economy to market economy. So in our case, the stock exchange was formally set up in 1995, and we started trading in 1996. As I mentioned, from the very beginning, we were created as a private entity compared with some other exchanges in the region. They started as a government-owned entity. So from the very beginning, banks and brokerage houses were both our owners, shareholders, and members. We started as a not-for-profit corporation. Then after a few years, we transformed ourselves into for-profit joint stock company. So that is about the foundation. Maybe I can also share that in this quarter of the century of history, we, let's say, had few development phases. In the very beginning, that was the idea. The stock exchange was created to facilitate the privatization in the 90s. Then we were, let's say, a kind of mechanism for concentration of the ownership after the privatization, because in our case in Macedonia, the privatization was with quite dispersed ownership structure at the very beginning. So for a few years in late 90s, we were, let's say, serving this function, consolidation of ownership. Then, let's say, in the period 2005-2007, it was a very, let's say, strong bull market with plenty of foreign portfolio investors present at our market, mainly from this region. So this is our golden era. In that time, 2007 was a record year in terms of turnover, increase of prices, etc. And then with the world economic and financial crisis, we entered a period of very stagnation, hibernation. It was, let's say, for years after 2008, quite modest turnover. All foreign portfolio investors withdrew from the market. And starting, let's say, last 3 years, the situation on the market is, let's say, significantly improved. Now we have, let's say, better performance. Our index is going up 6 years in a row. For example, in last 5 years, MBI 10, our main equity index, is up around 180%. And for example, last year, the turnover was more than 200 million euros annually, which for our circumstances is quite good one. Or let's say, put it like this, last year the total turnover was best in the last decade. So last few years, it's a quite good performance. We will see for this year, all the first 5 months are quite okay, although all these challenges in the world economy and in geopolitics, etc. So this is briefly our story. We have around 90 listed companies, but I guess we will speak about some other details in the continuation of the conversation.
So very interesting. You've been having a good series of years with this late QE rally has filtered through to the Macedonian Stock Exchange. You've seen growth coming back, but as you say, the golden age was really up to, gosh, 15 years ago now, when you had that run up to 2007. It's interesting how that had such an impact, and really so many markets in SEE have struggled to recover in the way that they had such momentum at that time.
Yes, that's right. although we now have, as I explained, quite a good period, it's still, for example, if you compare the price levels, it's still quite lower than at that time. For example, the highest level of our index was in August 2007. It was more than 10,000 points, and it's still, let's say, quite lower, 40 or something percent lower still. So at that time it was really euphoria. Many domestic players were, let's say, trading on the stock exchange, but the main drivers were foreign investors from the region, especially from Slovenia and Croatia. They came and they were active not only at Macedonian market, but as we mentioned in other markets in the region, on the wave of this global surplus of liquidity. They have to invest all this fund. The liquidity was huge, so it is let's say quite complex to this situation to be replicated in that extent.
Very interesting. I mean, you mentioned the investment, obviously the flows out of both Slovenia and Croatia, and certainly the insurance companies and the various pension funds of Slovenia, we know, have been pivotal players in a lot of the former Yugoslav republics, amongst others. Talking about Croatia, of course, it's very interesting. We'll get on to your broader cooperation in a moment, but I do believe, well, it's quite newsworthy because just this week you've made this announcement, or at least it was reported in Monday's Exchange Invest, about the Zagreb Stock Exchange increasing their stake to 9.92% in your bourse.
Yes, this is quite recent development. On Friday, there was a transaction with which Zagreb Stock Exchange is now around 10% of the ownership in Macedonian Stock Exchange. So this is period in which there are this kind of strategic transactions. For example, our stock exchange also recently became shareholder in our central securities depository. So we are owning there around 20%. In the meantime, Zagreb Stock Exchange increased their stake in our exchange. So we are living quite interesting time in terms of this, let's say, strategic acquisitions between infrastructural institutions of the markets here.
So that's very interesting. Actually, let's just step back for a moment then. So what are the components of the Macedonian Stock Exchange? Because you're just mentioning the fact that you own a 20% stake in the CSD.
You mean in terms of ownership?
In terms of what are your business units? You operate the primary and secondary stock market, and do you have any other business entities or subsidiaries?
Okay, the main financial instruments that are traded here are still stocks and bonds. The market is not mature enough, and we do not have other instruments like derivatives or some other instruments. So mainly shares, but also quite a lot of government bonds are traded through our exchange, especially because in our case, our government is still once in a year issuing so-called restitution bonds for this is connected with the former system, etc. So government bonds are traded. In the last few years, few corporate bonds were also listed and from time to time are traded, but mainly shares. Internally, we are organized more or less like other exchanges in the region. Two main departments are: we have business operations department, who is responsible for listing, trading, and surveillance, and we have IT department, because all exchanges are, as everybody knows, quite dependent on IT functioning, and all these regional exchanges are, let's say, quite small in terms of number of employees. So in this regard, IT functioning, all systems are quite important to function, let's say, smoothly. So we are maintaining not only the trading system, but also a few years ago we managed to provide to our brokers they are broker office systems. So we are kind of IT provider for that for our brokers. And now with our stake in the Depository, the next project will be the replacement of the CSD software as well. So we are very active in this IT aspect of our functioning. Of course, we have legal department, some people that are responsible for PR, etc. So this is generally how we are organized and in which instruments we are most active in organizing the trading.
So very interesting, because you mentioned your IT functions. Do I understand correctly? I mean, are you running your own trading system, or do you take that from a third-party vendor?
Historically, the system was acquired from Ljubljana Stock Exchange. So actually, it's this old BTS Slovenian system. In our case, the abbreviation is BEST system, right? Like Bursa Electronic Trading System, and also the abbreviation is quite good. So our system is BEST system. So we acquired the system a long time ago, but in the meantime, we acquired also the source code. We did some modernization. We let's say changed the technology on which the trading platform is running, and now we are, let's say, in full control of the system, and we are maintaining the system. So although we did not develop the system, it's more or less now like our own proprietary system.
Well, that's fabulous, of course, because that gives you a huge cost benefit advantage as well from running your own system, in terms of not having to pay a huge amount of hard currency out west, right?
Actually, during this golden era, many of the exchanges in the region decided to switch the systems and to go with these more expensive systems. We are quite, let's say, happy that at that time our assessment was that we should stick with this system, because this is very, let's say, cost efficient in terms of maintenance, and this is quite contributing to our profitability nowadays. So our reason is that we will change the system only if this is part of some other strategic project integrating with some other alliance of stock exchanges or something. So because it's very important to have cost-effective system for a small stock exchange.
Understandable, absolutely clear, and I think very, very good idea all round. So explain to me, I mean, your career, how did you come to get into the stock exchange itself? Because you were saying you've been there since pretty much the foundation. Actually,
frankly speaking, even before the stock exchange started the trading, I joined a team of few people that were organizing the start of trading. So I'm with the stock exchange for 26 years, so from the very beginning. Before that, I was working for 2 years in one specific government institution that was in existence at that time. It was called Bank Rehabilitation Agency. It was connected again with the transition and with, let's say, trying to put these old banks to let's say more firm position, cleaning the balance sheets, etc., etc. I joined the stock exchange in a way incidentally. I learned that the stock exchange is set up and that they're asking for some, let's say at that time, younger people to work there. I applied and I ended up as a floor manager because we were trading at classical trading floor for first 5 years. So that's how I started with the stock exchange.
Fascinating altogether, and quite a tale. And I think one of the things that's interesting, of course, is that a lot of people watching this show, particularly out west, aren't going to realize the quite dynamic history of the 1990s in Yugoslavia, because not only was there the problems of the civil war and therefore the breakup and the establishment of the independent states, but also in the aftermath. I mean, you battled with near hyperinflation in various parts. So you had all sorts of different issues that occurred, and a lot of those waves fanned across the whole former Yugoslavia, but particularly also impacted you as you were endeavoring to build the whole stock exchange of Macedonia.
At the beginning of the 90s was quite a complex period for whole, let's say, former Yugoslavian countries. But besides all these difficulties, you listed them quite correctly, it was also a time in which we were building this new economic system, market economy, and big enthusiasm at that time. Let's say when we were creating the stock exchange, expectations were quite high. If you want, maybe a little bit naive, that the evolution of the capital markets in these new market economies will go like in the most developed countries. It ended up that societies and economies should mature in order to have capital markets like in developed markets. So the story of all stock markets in the region are that we are trying to build something. It goes more slowly than we expected, but now we know that this is a logical outcome because this is an evolution, although we will speak for sure about the capital market revolution, but in our case it's more evolution.
So it's quite fascinating because obviously you've had this long period of capital market evolution. Also, one of the things that's been taking place recently is regional cooperation. And through that, I mean, the very interesting project of C-Link, SEE-Link. Tell us a little bit about the birth of that project.
Yeah, maybe first few words about the context why we initiated this C-Link project. We are completely aware here in the region that capital market securities industry is business of size. We are aware that all these economies are quite small, which means that capital markets and stock exchanges are also small, and we have to, let's say, find ways how to integrate ourselves in order to be more attractive in the eyes of the big institutional investors that are of the region. Also, many of us, we are aware that autonomous factors for further capital market development are quite limited, again, because of the business of the size. In our case, for example, in Macedonia, because privatization is more or less completed, so there are no, let's say, plenty of IPOs. So maybe the only autonomous factor is pension system. In our case, we have both the second and the third pillar in place. But again, on the demand side, after years, we have quite good situation. Also, classical investment funds were set up, but it's a problem with the supply side. So all together, for years in this region, stock exchanges were speaking about how to integrate themselves. It's difficult to go with one stock exchange for the region because of the national, let's say, divisions, also need for harmonization of the legislation, etc., etc. So in 2015, few exchanges, as we mentioned, Zagreb Stock Exchange, Bulgarian Stock Exchange Sofia, and our stock exchange, so Macedonian Stock Exchange, we decided to set up a company which will run order routing platform, which will connect members of our exchanges. We deliberately went with this approach because it is quite clear that if we go with, let's say, clear combination of all exchanges into one trading venue, it will be difficult. So we started with the order routing system in order to facilitate the flow of orders between our member firms, and in order to be more present on the radars of the foreign investors. Maybe after 5-6 years, we can conclude from the very beginning we were, let's say, prudent or moderate optimists. We can see now that order flow is not big, but C-Link, let's say, managed to have other positive externalities. We started few other projects in parallel. For example, again with the support of European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, we managed to have now a kind of regular equity research coverage of the main listed companies in the region, and we are publishing free of charge these reports on a specially created by C-Link website. So we are trying to, let's say, reduce this information asymmetry that actually is quite a big challenge in the region. So on a quarterly basis, everybody now could see what are the analysis and recommendations. EBRD choose Wood Investment Company from the Czech Republic to be partner in this project. So C-Link is order routing system, but also is a kind of alliance between the stock exchanges in which we are trying to exchange knowledge and plus, let's say, initiate some other projects. In the meantime, besides these three exchanges, other exchanges joined, not in the ownership of the company, but as a part of the C-Link activities, which are Ljubljana Stock Exchange, Belgrade Stock Exchange, and both exchanges from Bosnia, Banja Luka, and Sarajevo.
Very interesting. So you're covering now quite a considerable number of people, because obviously the population of Macedonia is what 2 million-ish people, something like that, right? Whereas now you're essentially covering the whole of the former Yugoslavia plus Bulgaria, which gets you up to actually a rather considerable number of people, doesn't it? About the better part of 40 million, something like that, if my math are correct, something along those lines.
30 plus.
Yeah, 30 plus, certainly. That's quite interesting, and quite a series of very, very dynamic, different markets around and about. And I mean, you mentioned obviously the assistance of the EBRD, which I think has been really pivotal in terms of trying to drive forward what's been going on in this area. But nonetheless, I mean, there's a lot of stock exchange geopolitics around, isn't there? And particularly in the Balkans and the broader SEE region, it's quite fascinating to look at what's been going on.
Yeah, you're right. The stock exchange, let's say, scene here in the region is in the terms of this geopolitics is quite, let's say, vibrant and different. For example, if I do a kind of short, let's say, explanation, we have Zagreb Stock Exchange, who is owning completely Ljubljana Stock Exchange. Ljubljana Stock Exchange used to be part of Vienna Stock Exchange Group, but then Vienna sold to Zagreb. And also, as we previously mentioned, Zagreb Stock Exchange is a minority shareholder in our stock exchange. So this is, let's say, one part of this picture. Then we have Istanbul Stock Exchange, who acquired some stakes years ago in Sarajevo and also in Podgorica Stock Exchange in Montenegro. And recently, last year, Belgrade Stock Exchange, they did a kind of barter contract with Athens Stock Exchange. They got their trading system, and in return, now the Athens Stock Exchange has a ownership stake minority in Belgrade Stock Exchange. So it's quite interesting. We used to have Vienna, now they withdraw. Now the Zagreb is regional, let's say, integrated in a way. Then we had Istanbul. They did that acquisitions quite a long time ago. They are now not so, let's say, proactive in doing something else. And we have now this Belgrade-Athens, let's say, cooperation. So definitely we will see what will, let's say, derive from all this stock exchange geopolitics in the region.
Well, it's very interesting, though, because you mention a lot of really important key players in the region. Obviously, Istanbul, who've historically had a great deal of influence going back hundreds of years around the Balkans and so on. And you mentioned how Zagreb have played a leading role in terms of what they've been up to, etc. There are a couple of fascinating pointers, I think, here. I mean, first of all, there are rumors, are there not, that also there's some element of Chinese investment going on, possibly into Banja Luka and Sarajevo, or perhaps that's actually taken place and I've just missed it.
Yes, it's interesting. Zagreb is now in the former Yugoslavian, let's say, uh, area, the biggest stock exchange in terms of many indicators, and obviously they had a strategic vision into integrating at least part of the region. About Banja Luka Stock Exchange, there is no, let's say, public info about their ownership. At least I'm not aware of that. But we will see. We decided as Macedonian Stock Exchange and also our shareholders that our future is to be part of bigger alliance. As Zagreb Stock Exchange bought Ljubljana Stock Exchange, and they approached some of our shareholders. These transactions were carried out, and now we are closely connected with Zagreb Stock Exchange. We are cooperating in sealing with them, and we hope that probably with further increase of their stake in Macedonian Stock Exchange, we will start to work on a joint development project, because this is, at least from our perspective, the idea. We are not speaking only about ownership integration. We would like to have more projects. We will have to have a better sales channels for our products through these bigger exchanges, know how European legislation, harmonization, assistance, etc.
Yes, it's very interesting. And then, I mean, you mentioned the fact that Zagreb, which is very interesting because obviously Zagreb is in the European Union through Croatia being a member for many years now. And obviously it's quite intriguing because so many countries are sitting outside the European Union in the region. But it's also fascinating that Belgrade, which sits as pretty much the largest and most populous country in the former Yugoslavia, has actually seen itself become a secondary player to Zagreb thanks to the dynamism of the Zagreb management. And certainly it's very interesting as we're sitting here, ladies and gentlemen. I think we've got a slight pause at the moment. We're going to get Ivan back onto the show in just a second. I'm here in London today. We've got a series of meetings throughout the course of the week for our various business offerings, where we're looking at, well, talking about the SEE market, meeting an SEE market builder in the shape of Ivan Steriev. He is the Chief Executive Officer of the Macedonian Stock Exchange. We've been hearing all about how interesting it is that Macedonia is retaining the name of the stock exchange because it's a private enterprise, although the nation itself has undergone a bit of a rebrand thanks to negotiations with Greece. I'm terribly sorry, a little bit of an internet gremlin there, Ivan, caused you to disappear. So we were just at the, I suppose in my case, I was going to ask you a question which intrigued me because we've talked about Istanbul. You were talking about Zagreb and their development in terms of being a market leader and so on. And you're welcome to expound on that again. But actually, the one thing that fascinates me is the biggest exchange in the former Eastern Europe, Central Eastern Europe and Southeastern Europe is obviously the Warsaw Stock Exchange. And yet they haven't been mentioned in the course of this discussion so far in terms of any activity in the region.
They were interested. For example, now we are, let's say, connected with Zagreb Stock Exchange, but from the point of view of Macedonian Stock Exchange, our first attempt for, let's say, selling part of the ownership of the exchange was back in 2008. At that time, we organized, let's say, the specific process for selling a part of the stock exchange. We hired, let's say, consultants, and at that time we did the teaser document, and 3 exchanges were generally interested. It was OMX, it was Zagreb then again, and also at that time Warsaw Stock Exchange was also interested for the region. But again, with the world financial crisis, whole business models of the regional exchanges was changed, and then all exchanges withdrawn. Then, what are current plans of Warsaw Stock Exchange in the region? I'm not, let's say, aware of, but I guess that many exchanges, including Warsaw, are closely monitoring what is going on with the integration of the region, what will be the next step of Zagreb or Istanbul, because in my opinion, this is first step, a kind of, let's say, regional integration, and then probably we will have another step when the integrated, let's say, region will be maybe interesting for some even bigger stock exchange alliance or some stock exchange who is by its own.
Yes, very interesting altogether how Warsaw, and of course Warsaw, as we know, just recently bought the Armenian Stock Exchange. That deal was finally went through just a few weeks ago, so even further to the east of you. But it is interesting that they haven't made a greater impact. Of course, on the other hand, at least the Polish economy did manage to go without a recession in the global decoupling of 2008-2009, which was quite an achievement on the macro. Tell me one thing, just out of your personal opinion, why do you think Austria, which traditionally had a huge imperial influence around the region, why do you think Austria, the Vienna Stock Exchange, didn't manage to make more progress, despite the fact that they were really the first people into the region trying to do deals, 20 years ago?
I can only speculate. I'm not, let's say, fully informed, but in my opinion, it was, let's say, bad timing. They bought few of the exchanges in the region, especially Ljubljana, at the height of that bull market in 2007, 2008. Then the expectations were quite high, I guess, in connection with the amount invested. Then some personal changes in both stock exchanges happened in Vienna and also in Ljubljana, and somehow momentum was lost in combination with, I guess, big expectations in after crisis period, and after a quite short period of time they decided to sell. So the short answer is probably not very well combination of let's say facts and timing.
Yes, interesting. Timing could well have been everything there, because certainly they were very, very aggressive in the period just before the massive discombobulation of 2007, 2008. Now, it's also fascinating because, obviously Deutsche Börse, they have taken a great deal of interest in the region at different times, but for whatever reason, it seems to me that they ended up selling more software than they did really trying to get into bed with what was going on. I'm not sure if you have any thoughts on why it might have been that they didn't stretch further into the region.
I can agree with you. Mainly their presence in the region was in the area of selling their trading system, and for now, as I know, not some firm plans to, let's say, be more active in this other role as an integrator of the small market in the region. But I assume Deutsche Borse is so big player, they have other global priorities. Probably this region for now is, let's say, too small for them.
Yes, and I suppose that also accounts for how we saw the very interesting wave. OMX, when it was independent, obviously was very interested in the region and actually owned the Armenian Stock Exchange, which I think it ultimately sold back to the government. But they didn't really make much of an impact around the area at all, eventually.
As I mentioned, before joining the Nasdaq Alliance, OMX was quite interested to be integrator in this region. So they were negotiating with many exchanges, including with Macedonian Stock Exchange. But that was in the same time when they reached the deal to join Nasdaq Alliance. And then the same story, when they become even part of the bigger alliance, this region started to be, I suppose, less interesting for them. Although after all these years, and I was, let's say, participating in many discussions about this area, probably OMX was quite when it was, let's say, before Nasdaq, integration, was quite natural integrator of this region, because it was developed market, but from the area of Europe with small nations, and they did quite good job with Baltic countries, and at that time we believed that OMX could be quite a good integrator. But in their case, with Nasdaq deal, their priorities went into other directions.
Yes, very interesting how ultimately the story of OMX was defined by their Nasdaq alliance, which removed them very significantly from the picture of trying to do something similar to what they'd done in the Baltic states across the Balkans. So that's the geopolitics, which is quite fascinating, because nonetheless, even though we've just spent several minutes talking about the people who aren't involved, the reality is, and as we're sitting here talking to Ivan Steriev, the CEO of the Macedonian Stock Exchange, and we're discussing his career as an SEE market builder, you have got C-Link, you've got very significant interest from the likes of Istanbul, Athens, and obviously Zagreb, as you mentioned, quite significantly playing a key role in the area. So there's obviously a great deal is still happening in this market, and nonetheless, the market is still remarkably nascent. But let me ask you actually about the problems you face domestically. I mean, for example, the one thing that I notice is if we take Warsaw as a benchmark, Warsaw has had no problem for many years generating countless IPOs. Okay, admittedly, of course, it's the capital of Poland, and Poland's a 50 million person nation, or sorry, 40 million person nation, about 44 million now, thanks to many Ukrainian refugees tragically driven across the border due to the invasion by Russia there. But the region, I mean, I'm not trying to pick on your exchange. I mean, all of the exchanges around you, and that can stretch all the way, in fact, to even somewhere like Romania, they all seem to have a huge problem with IPOs. Am I right? I mean, there seems to be a relatively few IPOs take place around the region.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I have already mentioned that the main challenge of many markets here in wider region is now on a supply side. Demand side it used to be a problem on demand side at the beginning of our development, but now it's vice versa. So the main, let's say, reason why supply side is a problem is exactly the lack of IPOs. For example, in our case, if you analyze what was going on in last 2 decades, we are still waiting for real IPO. All public offerings at our market was connected either because of the, let's say, regulatory requirements for increasing the capital, for example, banks or insurance companies, or it was when companies were capitalizing the accumulated profits, or after takeovers, but then there is no free float. So we are still waiting for this, let's say, classic story of family-owned company that is growing for years, then at a certain point of time to do IPOs. So and more or less it's the same in other countries in the region, with some let's say exceptions from time to time, but there is no consistent pattern of companies entering the public markets like in Western developed markets. So what are the reasons? Still, after all these years, the main obstacle, in my opinion, and also let's say some recent surveys that Macedonian Stock Exchange did it actually confirms that it's a fear of dilution of ownership still. So either it's a mentality issue, or maybe again lack of some detailed knowledge, but even these big companies, good entrepreneurs, are still preferring to have completely full control in the ownership. And also it's a kind of hesitation to be completely transparent. When you combine these two factors with a long period of quite low interest rates and relatively sound and well capitalized banking systems in the region, many of these companies literally did not have, let's say, a real need to tap the market. We will see what the future will bring, especially with the obvious trend of increasing of interest rates in the forthcoming periods. But we will have this situation, interest rates probably will go up, which will be maybe impetus for some of the companies finally to not look only to bank financing, but on the other way, rise of interest rates and inflation and everything will change the overall environment, and the timing to tap the markets will not be maybe, let's say, ideal. But these are my comments about the IPOs, and this still is the biggest challenge for smaller markets in our region.
So intriguing. We're meeting an SEE market builder today, Ivan Steriev. He's the CEO of the Macedonian Stock Exchange. And Ivan, just to unpack that a little bit, really, really fascinating. So clearly if you want to put it this way, muscle memory of corporate, well, in your case, Macedonia, but also around the region, remember incredibly high interest rates. I mean, interest rates that would make the eyes pop of the average American who was even around 20 years ago. And obviously, given the QE-addled period that we've been through, the cost of borrowing has been so low, everybody's been very excited about what they could manage to do. And that, you feel, has been a significant driver of people away from the stock market, or at least stopped them going to the stock market. So the end of QE might actually be a good time for your business. Do you think that that's likely to come with more debt and bonds being issued, given the issues you were talking about just a moment ago in relation to dilution?
Difficult to say. I think that, again, maybe in the equity part of financing, more changes are ahead of us. Not so much about bond issuing. But for sure, this new environment with higher interest rates will impact the development of the capital markets and the financing of the companies. My guess is that finally some of them will go with equity financing and with non-banking financing because of this.
And so it's very interesting, because the one thing you haven't mentioned so far, and therefore I'm intrigued to ask about, is the corporate structures, the corporate environment. Are there any particular reasons why it's difficult to IPO, for example, on your market? Because if I remember correctly, historically in the likes of Serbia, it was almost impossible to manage to actually do an IPO because the law and the regulations seem to be almost contradictory, at least until a few years ago.
In our case, it's not up to the regulation. Regulations is more or less standard one. It's again definitely these mental barriers of some of the biggest corporations, and let's say having absolutely no problems to obtain cheap banking finance. You know, for the development of the stock markets in the region, the best companies are quite, let's say, comfortable with their position, with having banks supporting them, and they're not, let's say, tapping our markets. And when you are speaking about with some companies that are not with the high quality, then it's a problem to attract investors for them. We had few examples like that when some of the companies started conversations with investors, with pension funds, but they were not with the best quality. And the best quality companies are completely, for now, let's say, satisfied with banking finance. And in our case, because of the problems with the banks at the beginning of the transition, the banks are quite capitalized. Bank supervision is with quite good quality, and they can serve the needs of the corporate sector. It's another question whether banks are doing optimal macroeconomic allocation of funds, and that's why probably the role of the capital markets should increase, because market is doing better allocation, because in the banking sector sometimes some other factors are prevailing when they're deciding when and how to place loans.
Really interesting altogether, and it's great to hear that there are no particular structural impediments. However, looking around, not necessarily just your own country, but therefore the region, do you think that there's going to be a difficulty if we do see a rush of potential issuances in the intermediary capability to manage to keep up with that? Because obviously your brokers, not just in your country, but throughout the SEE link and the region, have not been used to a lot of IPOs. Is that possibly going to cause a problem if there is suddenly a race to market in a higher interest rate environment?
Let's say this will be a sweet problem. Yeah, if we end up with this kind of situation in which so many companies suddenly will decide to tap the markets, our financial intermediaries are not, both in terms of number and in terms of maybe know-how, so let's say appropriate for this influx. And but as I said, this will be another type of problem. Let's say I would like to see this kind of problem to happen.
I can entirely understand. It's a sort of problem that you'll be very happy to deal with should it emerge in the near future.
Then this regional integration will become even more important, because in that case it will be let's say more business for other intermediaries for the region, and then I think it will be not push for regional integration only from the market operators, but then the business will be more, let's say, actively involved in this, because the business case will be quite tangible.
Fascinating, really, really fascinating. A very, very upbeat point, which I think brings us to a beautifully logical conclusion at the moment from what is an exciting and dynamic region of growth around you, and also the SEE link and so on. So you mentioned earlier on, Ivan, the process of evolution, which has been much of the history of your marketplace. But I've got to ask you the question that we ask every participant in this show. Where do you see the capital market revolution going next?
And let me try to continue with the same logic. After some revolution in the different areas of the economy and the society, maybe the period of let's say calming down will occur. So maybe after so many, let's say, innovations and different let's say developments, maybe we will face the period in which we will speak about let's say evolution, not only a revolution. But of course the capital markets will be globally preoccupied with the green economy, with ESG aspects, maybe about some specific IT aspects of functioning. I suppose that regulators will be more active in trying to find ways how to regulate these retail trading platforms, because, for example, what happened with Wall Street bets and GameStop, it's quite intriguing issue how to cope with that. So I think that first we will not have such a big revolutionary let's say developments, but on the other hand, I list few of them that will be priorities for both the business side, but also the regulatory side. In our area of Europe, as I said, revolution will be to finally start to have consistently and permanently some of the normal developments in developed markets, like IPOs and more companies being on the public markets.
Ivan Steriev, a man who's bringing evolution through revolution or revolution through evolution. And you can look at it either way, but at the same time, with your involvement in SE Link, with your involvement across the region, and particularly as CEO of the exchange, I applaud you. You mentioned the wonders of the green economy, and certainly I can think of very few more pleasant, wonderful, and beautiful green and verdant lands than your own country. However one wants to name it, it's a beautiful and fascinating place to be. Next week, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to be welcome to Max Butty. Max is going to be on discussing developing digital assets. He's one of the leading boffins around at SDX, the Swiss Digital Exchange, which is an arm of the SIX Swiss Exchange Group. But for today, it remains only for me to say that this has been a great opportunity to meet an SCE market builder. We've heard all about C-Link. We've heard about the Macedonian Exchange's travails, troubles, and indeed the very, very interesting, exciting story that we've heard today about the way that QE may actually be the making of an IPO market in the future, and seeing many more bond issues to boot. We wish you, Ivan, every success in the world. When you get that problem with your brokers and you have a pipeline issue because you've got so many IPOs, let's come back and talk about that in the future. And I look forward to seeing your smile once again when we're listening to the issues that you have raised there. In the meantime, I wish you every success throughout your exchange and indeed with your career. My name is Patrick L. Young. I just want to say a huge thank you to our production team today. It's been a joy having Beata, Natalie, Marianne, and indeed Racy in the studio, as well as Janella. This has been IPO-VID number 68. We'll be back next week for number 69. My name is Patrick L. Young, wishing you a great week in blockchain, life and